Welcome to Claim Your Mind, where we dive into trending events around us and find life lessons in developing self-awareness and critical thinking skills. I'm your host Sid, and today we confront a catastrophe that never should have happened in the first place. The crash of Air India Flight 171, a Boeing 787 Dreamliner that suddenly fell 32 seconds after takeoff from Ahmedabad, India on June 12, 2025. The crash killed 260 people, 241 on board and 19 on the ground. This wasn't fate. I can say with a fair degree of confidence that foundation of this avoidable disaster was set in motion by United States Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA. The FAA set in motion the foundation of this catastrophe by its flawed 2018 advisory, leaving this deadly flaw unchecked. This 2018 bulletin noted that some Boeing aircrafts, including the 787, had fuel control switches installed with a locking feature disengaged, increasing the risk of accidental operation. The self-styled social media experts all over the globe are poring over discrete flight data, wreckage, cockpit voice recorder, and psychology of the pilots, etc. But let me tell you that these alone won't uncover the broken process controls that doomed this flight. The broken process controls which were known and hence avoidable. The broken process controls which were known since 2018, where the severity of the issue was undermined. It was underrated. We must look beyond the cockpit to find the root cause of the crash. The fault, in my opinion, was not in the cockpit alone, but the trigger was outside the cockpit. In this podcast, I will uncover about the external trigger that caused the crash and who really held this trigger and who really should be held responsible for this disaster. India's Aircraft Accident Investigation Bureau's preliminary report points to a chilling immediate cause. The immediate cause was that both fuel control switches flipped to cut off, starving the engines. Yet, the social media is rife with people who dare to smear the pilots. Let's not forget that pilots today are reduced to mere executors of a high-stakes video game, a video game unfolding in a highly automated cockpit. All this smearing of the pilots is happening while the real culprits, the Federal Aviation Administration and Boeing, they escape scrutiny and responsibility. As someone who has worked with GE aircraft engines and now GE Aerospace in Southeast Asia and also at the Cincinnati headquarters at Unveiled, I have first-hand experience of how rigorous safety processes can save lives or how their betrayal can destroy them. This is a story of negligence, heartbreak, and a shameful rush to scapegoat the innocent pilots. The pilots who lost their lives and they cannot even defend themselves. Buckle up, because I will uncover the truth about how the FAA's failure caused loss of precious lives in AI 171 crash. And the truth will certainly shake you. Before we dive in, let's do a quick recap of what most of us might already know so far. On June 12, 2025, Air India's Flight 171, a Boeing 787 Dreamliner bound for London Gatwick, it taxied from Bay 34 at Ahmedabad's Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel International Airport. At 13:08 hours India Standard Time, the aircraft received takeoff clearance. The aircraft carried 230 passengers and 12 crew members in a Boeing 787 Dreamliner aircraft, and the aircraft, powered by General Electric's GEE NX-1B engines. At 13:39 hours IST, just 32 seconds after liftoff, the aircraft crashed into a medical hostel near the airport, killing 260 people, 241 on board and 19 on the ground, leaving only one survivor, Mr. Vishwas Kumar Ramesh, who was seated near an emergency exit. This was India's deadliest aviation disaster in decades and Boeing's 787's first fatal accident. India's Aircraft Accident Investigation Bureau's preliminary report lays bare a haunting sequence. Within seconds after takeoff at 650 feet, both fuel control switches moved from run to cut off, starving the GE NX-1B engines of fuel. The cockpit voice recorder captured the pilot's shock and desperation. One asked, "Why did you cut off?" The other promptly but confidently replied that, "No, I did not do it." Doesn't that conversation indicate that the switches were not manually moved, but the circuits and software behind them could have malfunctioned? It is prudent for me to mention here that physical interface of the switches in the cockpit triggers electronic circuitry leading up to the full authority digital engine control, the FedEx system. It is the FedEx system which electronically interprets the switch position and commands the valve to open or close accordingly. There's a whole lot of back-end technology that could go wrong, even though fuel switches seem to be mechanically working with no fault. A mayday call followed, but the plane was already doomed. The flight data confirms that the switches briefly hit cutoff, triggering a failed engine relight, though they were found in run post-crash, suggesting a momentary but fatal glitch. The smoking gun lies in 2018 Special Airworthiness Information Bulletin, the SAIB, numbered Nancy Mama 1833, issued on December 17, 2018 by the United States Federal Aviation Administration. The bulletin flagged a critical flaw, according to which the fuel control switch lockings on Boeing 737s using the same part number as Boeing 787 could disengage, allowing unintended movement that could cut fuel to the engines. And the part number? 4 Tango Lima 8373 Delta. This wasn't a minor issue. This issue risked catastrophic engine failure, and this low probability yet high impact risk, wrongly assessed by FAA in 2018, is what exactly struck the Air India Flight 171 in 2025. Unfortunately, FAA did not seriously consider the severity of this occurrence. It is tragic that in 2018 the Federal Aviation Administration deemed the issue as a mere recommendation, not an airworthiness directive. An airworthiness directive would have mandated inspections or fixes. Remember the industry best practice? Do preventive maintenance and minimize corrective maintenance. In the hindsight, both FAA and Boeing had a chance to enforce preventive maintenance as early as 2018. Airlines like Air India, constrained by budgets and complacent by the non-mandatory status of the FAA bulletin, might have skipped the checks. No defects were reported on Boeing 787 switches since 2023, but the risks lingered unaddressed. The risk unfortunately surfaced 7 years after the Special Airworthiness Information Bulletin in 2018, and by then 260 lives are already lost. The Federal Aviation Administration's failure to enforce a fix for a catastrophic risk known since 2018 turned out to be a deadly error of judgment on its part. An error of judgment where the severity was overlooked. A flawed judgment that set the timer ticking to lead up to a fatal AI-171 tragedy in year 2025. Now, before we dig deeper into why I hold FAA to be primarily responsible for this tragic incident, I will share with you a tool which is often used as a cornerstone of ensuring aerospace safety. This tool is Failure Mode Effects Analysis, a tool religiously followed across GE business processes as part of its Six Sigma culture. The FMEA is the go-to tool to assess and mitigate risks in an objectively systemized form. Let me also mention that the risks considered in FMEA are for critical to quality measures for both process and product outcomes. To keep things simple, I'm not specifically mentioning the people, technology, and governance related risks here. For the purpose of this podcast, I consider these as sub-risks ingrained into the process design and execution. Now, to put it simply, the failure modes and effect analysis evaluates potential failures by multiplying 3 factors: severity, how devastating; occurrence, how likely; and detection, can you catch it? And the result? The risk priority number, an RPN number that dictates prioritized actions for the risks. As per the industry benchmarks, an RPN score above 100 to 150 demands immediate response. I'm stating this fact with responsible conviction since I had the privilege to breathe and live the FMEA tool while working globally for various GE businesses across the globe, including GE aircraft engines in Southeast Asia and its headquarters in Avondale, Cincinnati, Ohio. My stint at GE ingrained into me a culture that drove relentless pursuit of quality and risk management. GE's Six Sigma data-driven methodology for defect reduction integrates failure modes and effect analysis to identify and prioritize risks before the services or product is made available for customer use. At GE, as part of Six Sigma sensitization, we studied the 1996 Ariane 5 rocket launch failure, a textbook case of failure modes and effect analysis gone wrong, and the history repeated itself in year 2025 in form of AI-171 crash. On June 4, 1996, the European Space Agency's Ariane 5 rocket exploded 37 seconds after launch due to software error in its inertial reference system. The software code was reused from Ariane 4 and it was not tested for Ariane 5's higher velocity, causing a data overflow, sending false navigation data that swung the rocket off course, triggering the rocket to self-destruct. The European Space Agency's failure mode and effect analysis failed to model this risk, underestimating both the severity and detection. The severity was $370 million explosion and loss of payload. And the failure to assess detection? The pre-launch simulations did not test the new conditions. This Ariane 5 explosion lesson drilled into us at GE aircraft engines taught us that no risk, however rare, can be ignored when the outcome is catastrophic. Now let us do an illustrative risk priority number calculation for the FMEA of Air India Flight 171, Boeing 787 Dreamliner's aircraft's fuel control switches. On a scale of 1 to 10, the severity is 10 because a dual engine failure at 650 feet is catastrophic, as the crash proved. Detection, dismal, an 8 or a 9. No sensor alerts pilots to an engage or disengage lock or switch movement. They rely on visual checks in the chaos of takeoff and pressures of on-time key performance indicators for the flight performance. Occurrence: the 2018 Special Airworthiness Information Bulletin probably presumed rarity, say a 3 or a 4. A rarity based on Boeing 737 reports. Remember, the same part working in a different circumstances is bound to behave differently. Ariane 5 rocket explosion taught us that, and that too as early as 1996. Now when we multiply the individual scores of severity, detection and occurrence, it results in an RPN number of 240 to 400, a blaring alarm for an airworthiness directive. Remember, a risk priority number above 100 to 150 dictates action demanding immediate response. Yet, the Federal Aviation Administration issued a toothless Special Airworthiness Information Bulletin. They issued SAIB bulletin considering a low occurrence and overlooking the detection and severity ratings. Air India, like many airlines, didn't act, prioritizing costs over caution. This oversight on part of Air India was tacitly endorsed by non-mandatory nature of the FAA bulletin. Now that it is evident that FAA failed to properly assess and address the weighted risk priority of the Boeing 787 Dreamliner's fuel control switch, I will now talk about most disturbing fact associated with the AI-171 crash. It's a heart-wrenching irony that some media reports and Federal Aviation Administration's July 11, 2025 statement calling the switch locks as safe. In such statements, they rush to prematurely pin this tragedy on Captain Sumit Sabharwal to 15,600 hours and including 8,600 hours flying on 787 Dreamliner alone. And also the first officer Clive Clunder with 3,400 hours. Picture their families, wives, children, parents reeling from the loss of their loved ones, only to see their names dragged through headlines as pilot error. I was seeing an interview on the Western media, and I wouldn't name the broadcaster, but the person is very well respected in the news circles. They were talking about that the pilot was not in a proper mental state because his father was not doing well. And he'd been telling his colleagues that he will plan to take a sabbatical after a few flights and take care of his father. Does such kind of a statement deserve the kind of interpretation that is being done by the Western media? Why are they doing it? For what? Why is the hurry to pin the blame on the pilot? All this public witch hunt much before the Aircraft Accident Investigation Bureau's final report. It is due in June 2026. This premature blame tarnishes legacy of both the pilots, robs their families of prestige and shatters their peace, piling unbearable grief atop an already unthinkable loss. Captain Sabharwal and First Officer Kundar were heroes, not culprits. They were both heroes betrayed by a system that failed in a cockpit where circuits and software, not men, call the shots. A cockpit designed by Boeing and regulated by FAA. The Boeing 787 is a flying supercomputer, not a manual stick and rudder relic. It's a fly-by-wire system, auto throttle, and electronic flight control system, the EFCS, reducing pilots as mere executors of a video game scripted by automation. Fuel control switches set to run before takeoff. They stay untouched unless an emergency like an engine fire. Any change to these switches demands a deliberate lift and toggle past the lock. The cockpit voice recorder reveals confusion, not error. One pilot simply asked, "Why did you cut off?" And the other promptly and confidently replied, "I did not." This is a crew betrayed by a system, likely a chip glitch or a design flaw, not negligence for sure. The electronic equipment at your home might still malfunction even though you do not touch the switch. Your TV or an AC unit might trip even though you never touch the switch. Remember that flawed electronic appliances at your home before you endorse the pilot error. The Federal Aviation Administration's rush to scapegoat pilots, ignoring their own failure to mandate the 2018 Special Airworthiness Information Bulletin despite a visibly high RPN number, is a heartless betrayal that deepens the wounds of 260 grieving families and the families of pilots inclusive. All this blame game and circus is happening when both the pilots tragically cannot defend themselves. Well, at GE Aircraft Engine Cincinnati headquarters in Avondale, I witnessed a Six Sigma driven safety culture that left no risk unchecked and unattended. The GE culture during my times with Jack Welch, aka Neutron Jack, in command, the directives was to test every single engine and catch every single issue before they could escalate. The Gen X 1B engine on Flight 17 was cleared, no faults. But what about the circuitry from cockpit to fuel lines leading up to the engines? These were part of Boeing aircraft's fuselage and Boeing's accountability. But GE's aircraft engines FMEA tool implemented with a wing-to-wing view of flying the highly automated aircraft would have flagged a fuel cutoff risk with a sky-high RPN number, demanding warnings, sensors, and even a redesign. The Ariane 5 case we studied in GEAE showed the cost of sloppy risk analysis. A $370 million rocket lost to an untested software glitch. The 2018 Special Airworthiness Information Bulletin proves that both FAA and Boeing knew the locks could disengage, yet no airworthiness directive was initiated. Both Boeing and FAA should be held responsible for facilitating 787's faulty fuel control switches slip through the cracks. Can FAA and Boeing explain why AD was not issued? Who would question them? It is easy to blame men behind machines, but asking questions from all-powerful original equipment manufacturer, the Boeing, and the regulator, FAA, is akin to bailing the cat. That's the real irony and tragedy of this avoidable crash. The Federal Aviation Administration's July 11, 2025 claim that switches are safe is tone deaf, contradicting the Indian Aircraft Accident Investigation Bureau's hint at a mechanical link to the 2018 Special Airworthiness Information Bulletin. Why no visible or audible sensor to detect switch movement? Why no mandatory fix after 7 years? This is negligence, not oversight. All the 260 victims, 169 Indian, 53 British, 7 Portuguese and 1 Canadian. They all deserve better than FAA's deflections. GE Aircraft Engines, now GE Aerospace, they set the standard that Federal Aviation Administration and the Boeing failed to meet it. GE's engines was impeccable, just that it was put on wings of a company that was looking at profits and not the quality and safety. My personal inclination would be to blame FAA more than anybody else, and that's because FAA as a regulator literally failed in its role to raise the alarm. FAA failed in its role to raise the alarm with the severity and the action it deserved. As an independent regulator, FAA's responsibility was to prevent the aircraft company's selfish interest in cutting corners to reduce costs. This tragedy demands urgent action. First, the Federal Aviation Administration must issue an airworthiness directive as soon as possible. Mandate inspection of fuel control switch locks, install sensors to detect unintended movement or design or redesign the system entirely. Second, make the failure modes and effect analysis a sacred process. Catastrophic risks, however rare, are never optional. Ariane 5 and Flight 171 are the proof. Engineers' focus on tools like flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder is critical, but it misses the root cause, such as lax regulation, flawed risk analysis. Fixing regulator as equally accountable as the original equipment manufacturer, the Boeing, and the operator, Air India. Third, end the scapegoating of the pilots. The pilots were mere executors in an automated cockpit. A cockpit where FAA and Boeing knew about the risks, but such risks were not communicated to the pilots with the gravity it deserved, with the urgency it deserved. The families of 260 victims, including those of Captain Sabharwal and First Officer Kundar, deserve answers, not cruel accusations that tarnish legacies. Just as Boeing 737 MAX crashes force reforms which Boeing avoided, the same Boeing 787 Dreamliner crash must also spark a reckoning. GE Aircraft Engine shows what's possible. The Federal Aviation Administration and the Boeing must rise to that standard of quality first, safety first. Air India's Flight 171 was a preventable tragedy. In 2018, the FAA scripted catastrophe with a special airworthiness bulletin they failed to enforce. Scapegoating pilots when the systems betrayed them compounds the agony of grieving families. My time at GEAE taught me safety demands unrelenting vigilance. 260 lives demand justice. The final report is a year away, but the truth screams now. Rare is no excuse for catastrophic. I'm Sid, signing off for today. Keep questioning, keep demanding better, and keep flying safe. Bye-bye.